So all the monotonous stuff is done. Today's going to be a little bit more fun. So what we're going to do today is we're going to fit our brass now with primers, and then we're going to develop a powder charge. What I mean by that is we're going to go through our database, we're going to have a look at a good starting and a good end, and I'll explain all why. And I'm also going to look at my data of what I've got from the past, and I'm going to make a decision based on that, which means that I won't have to make as many test rounds as I usually would. Let's get through it and I'll explain the process as we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that the primer pocket, which is over here, is uniformed, and that's quite simple. I just put it in that and I can feel straight away that there's nothing wrong there. It's perfect. The next thing we're going to want to do now is add some primers into our little device here. So I really like how this works. Basically, you just sit it in here and you shake it and it spits them out all the right way around. Let's double check that, close it, you put it just on the first lock. Stuck to the top. That just sits in here, and every time I pull the handle, that's going to drop a primer into here. We'll set our case on and we'll prime it. Shell holder sits in, drop the handle down, and there we have a very nicely seated primer. Now when the primer is seated into the case, you want to make sure that it's just under the surface over here. You don't want it flush or above. You need it just under there like that. That's absolutely perfect. So that one's done. So that's going to go in the case, which means it's ready for powder. And we'll keep going with the rest. Okay. Absolutely perfect. Let me tell you, it's so much easier to put primers in brand new brass. So the primers are done, and now it's on to the next stage, which will be putting in the powder charge. But where do we start? How much do we put in? What are we going to test? This is what I'm about to show you. Now I'm going to automatically write in, this is my little notebook, and there's heaps of notes on other things that I've done in there. So the first thing I'm going to put in there is, what am I shooting? Which is the rifle? What's the barrel twist? Just in case I may have used another rifle, so I know where I was at. I've written down that I'm going to be using I didn't want to stay there, did it? 168 grain HPBT, which is like a hollow tip bullet. I found these to be a lot more stable than the VMAX or the ELD match. So these are a match bullet, but it's a different type of projectile. I've just found them to work really well. Now they come both in Hornady and they also come in Sierra. Today we'll be using the Sierra brand. To be honest, I haven't noticed any difference between both. So, what's the next thing we have to work out? We're going to work out what length we're going to start with. So, because I want to show you from the beginning, we're going to start with maximum length, which is 71.12 millimeters overall. That's including the projectile. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to insert the projectile to maximum length, which will be somewhere about here. And then with the powder charge, that is our main tune. So imagine you've just built an engine and you've got to put a tune in it just to get it going. So you're doing that by adding the powder. Now we're going to have different amounts of powder, so we can then test with our chronograph and with our groupings which powder worked the best. Now once we have that detail, then we're going to start seeding these at different depths, further and further and further and further in. That's why we're starting at the maximum, and we're going to start seeding it more in. That is the fine tune. And that's what we're going to do in the next round after this. So let's get some powder done. This here will become your Bible. It's the ADI Powders Hand Loaders Guide. And this has in there most bullets, all the weights, all the grains, all the different powders, and it gives you a maximum and a minimum. So let's get to it. So I've scrolled down till I found 308 Winchester, and now I'm just going through to find what projectile I'm using. So there we have it, the 168 grain HPBT. Now we're using AR2208, so that's the powder that we're using over here, and that's telling us that at 42 grains of powder, we're going to be shooting at 2,384 feet per second. At 46 grains, and the C stands for compressed, we're going to be shooting at 2,576 feet per second. Now, the easiest way to begin is go straight in the middle. You can't go wrong. And then that way, you start a little bit lower from the middle, then you travel through the middle to the upper end of the middle, and you'll find your powder charge. Now you'll notice that most rifles will have two nodes, two good tunes. One will be with a lower powder, one will be slightly more powder. You have to choose when you look at the groups which one you prefer. So now we've got 42, 46, so 43.5 is halfway. But before I even start there, I'm going to go to my other little bag of tricks. This is some data that I collected from a similar projectile, a 168 grain. It wasn't a HPBT, it was an ELD match, but you'll find that the powders are usually roughly the same. They don't change much. It's more the weight of the projectile. So over here in the 42.8 range, it had an SD that was very high. So I'm not even going to look at that in this range. At 42.9, I had an 8.9, which is pretty good. Then we went over to 43, it came up to 18. 43.1, it went to 28. And then 43.2, we had a SD of 15.6. It's coming back down again. You can see the flow here. And at 43.3, we had a 9.3. So not much difference, but faster. We have to determine which is the one we want. So I'm going to go through this pattern again. I'm going to do the exact same charges. I'm going to ignore the 42.8, but I may go a 43.4 in case these new cases, or the Hornady or the new Starline, which is this one here, may have a little bit more capacity. So we want to make sure that we don't miss that node. So this is the unit that I'll be using to measure our gunpowder. You'll notice inside there's a little note. And what that is, it's pretty simple. It's just the last gunpowder that I used in there. And because I've emptied it, but I haven't thoroughly cleaned it, there's some little granules of gunpowder in there. If you were switching gunpowder, you wouldn't want to mix it. So you'd want to thoroughly clean it. But I knew I was going to use it for 308 again. So I got most of it out, but I just put that little note to say, hey, the last powder in here was 308. So the very first thing that we have to do before we do anything else is pull out this little weight here and ensure that it's flat. depending on your bench. That's pretty good. I'm going to hit the 0 button, and we're going to press and hold the calibrate. You want to calibrate this every time you start using it. Now I'm just going to pull that rubber off just to ensure that there's clearance and it's in the middle. And then I'll press and hold the calibrate button again, and it comes up with 0. So when I take that off, 77.1.6 is the number it should read, and that is now calibrated. So I'll put a little tray in there now and hit 0 again, and we'll start adding some powder. So my main thrower is this one here, which I program what I want it to shoot out, and once it reaches that amount of powder, it'll stop. Now, because this is not a laboratory machine, it's got a plus or minus of 0.01. But I want to know exactly where that falls. So what I do is I stop a grain or two before, and then I trickle. This is called a trickler. I trickle the powder slowly, grain by grain, until it hits the number that I want, and then I know that it's just turned to that weight. And I have found that to be amazingly accurate. So the first powder charge that we're going to do is 42.9. So I'm going to program it at 42.7. And we're going to hit enter. Wait for it to settle. Now that's gone exactly to 49, but I don't know where it is, so I'm going to grab some powder and take it out. And then okay, this is where we go slower. And it's just clicked at 42.9, and that's where I'm going to take that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my long funnel. I'm going to set it over the first case, and we're just going to drop that in. So I'll pop that in and I'll hit enter, which will bring me the same charge again. And on top of this case, I'm going to put an upside down projectile, which tells me that that case is full. Move on to the next one. Down to my last few cases after loading almost 70 rounds. I think by this stage you will have worked out that you need a lot of patience to do this. And if you're someone that's not patient, I'm just going to tell you now, don't start, because it's not for you. You definitely need to have a lot of patience. This is the last of the Starline brass, and I actually decided to go up a little higher to 43.5. Now, whenever it says an error, that basically says that it's overthrown the charge, so you just got to take some out and then top it up manually again. Nice and slowly. There you go. Here's our target. Drop it in. Call the next one whilst you're putting this one away. Now, there's something that I haven't mentioned that's very, very important. Whilst you're using your powder thrower or any measuring tool, or you're trying to get a very accurate load, don't touch the bench. You've got to make sure you've got to do whatever you can not to touch the bench at all, because it'll throw it out. Because we're not talking about grams here, we're talking about grains. And to give you an idea of the difference, so 1,000 grams, 1,000 grams in a kilo. In grain, which what we're dealing with, is 15,000. The last thing I have to do for tonight is make my note that goes inside each box. I'll be making 2 of them. One will go inside each of the boxes. And basically it's telling me my warm-up, what grain powder I've done, and it's got a list of powders, so I can enter that into my iPad as I'm shooting them for my notes, and then I'll be able to come back to you with the results. But I will be videotaping whilst I'm going through this at the range. Now, if I had no idea on this powder charge at all, if I'd never used this projectile before, I definitely wouldn't be starting at point 1. I would be working in increments of 0.2 or 0.3. 0.2 in the areas where I think it might be, and 0.3 in the outer region. And then when I start seeing that swing of a node, then I would then redo some powder in that area for a couple of rounds of 0.1 afterwards to see if I'm in that node or if I already was in it. So just wanted to clarify that. That's another step completed now. Our powders in the brass, our primers obviously were put in first, and we're getting ready to seat some projectiles tomorrow. Now, I know it can come across like a bit of a lengthy process, and it is. But the good thing is you've got to look at the bigger picture. Once we develop these rounds, that's it. You've got your data. So you may want to experiment to make it a bit longer and put more powder in it and stuff like that, but you'll have a basic bullet. Once we develop this round, you'll have that, and you'll have that data. So you can just go spit out 50 rounds, no experimenting, no nothing. But we have to go through all this first. And unfortunately, you've got to go through it. If you want to change your projectile to a heavier or lighter, you've got to go through all this again. But to me, that's half the fun. It's, you know, once you get out there, you perfect the bullet, and you go out there, and yes, you perfected at 100, you perfected at 2 or 3, 4, 5. You know, I just want to find another challenge. So for me, this is why I enjoy it. I hope you do too. See you on the next one.